Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Dan's Pro Shop. Today, if you haven't put it together from the thumbnail and the title of the video here, today we are going over the ArcCaptain MIG200. In case you don't know what that is, well, I mean, if you're here, you should. This is a multi-process dual voltage welder. If you don't know what that means, don't worry, we will get into it. But this just may tick off a lot of the boxes if you are looking for like a kind of do it everything, like Swiss Army knife, have at home welder. Like, I don't know necessarily if you would like start your own fabrication shop with something like this, but if you're looking for something for like home, farm, shop use that does a little bit of everything, maybe not the best at what it does, but it does a little bit of everything, you know, like a jack of all trades, but a master of none, I think this just might be the ticket. So let's dig into this ArcCaptain MIG200 and see what it's all about. So guys, here we are with the ArcCaptain MIG200. Now, if you guys are frequent to the channel, you know that I've gone over some ArcCaptain stuff in the past, particularly an ArcCaptain plasma cutter, which I will link that video up here or down in the description if you care to check it out. But dude, I gotta tell you, that thing like genuinely blew away my expectations. For the size of the machine and the price point of it, I was thoroughly impressed by what that thing could do. So whenever I noticed that they started dabbling into actual machines, I mean, let alone like a regular welder, but a multi-process and dual voltage welder, like I had to kind of see what this was all about because it did like genuinely pique my interest, if you will. Now, like I mentioned at the start of this whole thing, multi-process dual voltage. In case you guys are unfamiliar with what that means, we will briefly go over what all that means. Because, I mean, if you are new to this whole welding thing, it can kind of be overwhelming with all the nomenclature and acronyms and stuff that goes along with the whole welding scene. So I'll kind of break this down for you, and I don't know, we'll do like a couple minute crash course here. So we'll start off with the easy one, dual voltage. That means what this thing is plugged into and how it's powered, its source power. So dual voltage, like right now, I'm plugged into a 120 volt extension cord, just regular old wall power that everybody has. Every home in America has 120 volt regular wall power. That's fine and dandy. This thing can run on that, but bear in mind, if you do use the 120 volt like capabilities of this thing, you will be, dare I say, bottlenecked. You are not going to be able to achieve the full output potential of this machine if you give it the lower of the two possibilities of source of voltage. Just think about it this way. This thing is essentially a transformer. So your output is solely dependent on your input. So the bigger input power you give it, the bigger output potential you have. So just keep that in mind whenever you're doing stuff with this, like, you know, amperage, voltage output, duty cycle, all that crap will be directly related to the source power that you have it plugged into. So if you're going to be doing just a quick little zip, zap, jip, jap, whatever, you know, 120 volts, fine. But if you're really going to be laying down some iron with this thing, I strongly suggest a 240. Let's get into that. Now, when I say 240 volt, a lot of you probably know what I'm talking about, but some of you may not if you're here for the first time, or if this is just something that you're looking at. You know, 240 volt isn't like a normal term if you're not into this kind of stuff. So 240 volts, you know, for those of you with a ticker in math, it's double 120. So we are utilizing the full secondary side of the transformer on the pole out on the street. And this is an electrical engineering class. I'm just letting you know, like your dryer, your air conditioner, big heavy appliances in your home run on 240 volts. And that is what this plug is. And they give you this fancy little adapter to run either 240 or 120. This thing does both. So given the supply power of wherever you're using this thing, it gives you options, capabilities, and, you know, different abilities to use this thing depending on where you are. So like I mentioned, this thing is dependent on the source power to the output. So if you're really going to be laying down some weld, I strongly recommend plugging this thing into 240. But it is super cool that we have the ability to use both. You just put that anywhere. You have the ability to use both. So, you know, you're out in the middle of a driveway or something, and I don't know, you just whip a 100-foot extension cord out there. You just got to tack something on real quick. It's nice. And, you know, this thing, it's sizable, but for good reason, because of the capability of this thing. However, even though it's big, it's not heavy. So, you know, I have some genuine expectations for this thing. Let's just hope it keeps up with what I think it can do anyway. Now that we have the dual voltage thing over, let's go over the multi-process. Now, I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, and I don't want to come off condescending or anything. But just in case you are here for the first time and you are new to this process, like I mentioned, we're going to go over this real quick. So, multi-process. This thing does three, count them, three different processes of welding. Well, at least it's capable of doing three different processes of welding. I'll get into that and explain why I enunciated that sentence. Anyway, at its core, this thing does three different processes. It does what's commonly known as stick welding, or SMAW, shielded metal arc welding. And it also does MIG welding, which is commonly referred to as wire feed, or if you're used to hearing flux cord or solid wire, this thing is a wire feed machine. It MIG welds. So that means metal inert gas. You know, all of these words are acronyms. They mean stuff, but yeah, it's whatever. And this thing is also capable of doing TIG welding. That means tungsten inert gas. So are you kind of getting a little bit of a theme here, this inert gas thing? It takes a shielding gas to shield your weld pool from the atmosphere to keep impurities and crap out of your weld pool, so it actually does what it's supposed to do. But like I mentioned, that kind of gets into the science of things, and this isn't an engineering class. We're just looking at this here machine. Now, speaking of this here machine, since this thing is a multi-process and it has the capability to do three different processes, there is a caveat to that. In the box, in the kit, you know, you just seen the box here, now you see the stuff here. Everything you see here is everything that was in the box there. I promise you, there's no tomfoolery. What you see is in the kit. So this thing is multi-process. However, the stuff you get in the kit only allows you to do two. And that is two, yeah, it's too limited. I don't know if that's a good way to say it. Either way, we can do SMAW, or shielded metal arc welding, or stick welding as most call it, with this here adapter. Which, I mean, I gotta give it to them. This is actually a pretty decent quality. Like, we have like fiberglass insulators and like a decent heavy gauge cord here. I mean, it's no industrial thing. You're not welding bridges together with this, but this is significantly better quality than most machines in this price point. I'll give them that. So now we know we can do stick welding, and the kind of the core or the basis of this thing is MIG welding, or wire feeding. And I gotta give it to them. I really, really, really like that this MIG wire feeder gun, you know, this stinger as some would call it, is detachable. Because most, dare I say, higher quality machines, this thing is detachable. It comes off for not only for, you know, egress and usability and you know, user comfort to use and move this thing around, but to service your gun too, because there is a liner inside of this thing that houses the wire. So if you can imagine, there's like a steel, like continuous coil spring inside of this thing that the wire runs through. Because I mean, you can't run steel wire through a rubber hose and expect it not to wear through eventually. Now, don't get me wrong, liners go bad too, but I got to keep myself from rambling. What I'm getting at is I really, really, really like that this thing comes off. Because this thing is a multi-process welder, let's just say you're out there welding fence posts or something, and all you want to do is stick weld, because you're out in the middle of the field, it's raining, it's windy, it's dirty, it's just gnarly. So you're not going to be able to MIG weld, you need to stick weld. So if I'm not using this, I don't want to have this thing attached to this thing permanently and I'm lugging it around and take the chance of damaging this thing. And what I'm saying is it's nice that the front of this thing is completely empty except for what you're using. I really, really do like that. Now, for the caveat, what I said there, like it's like 2-ish. So this thing can do wire feed welding. So MIG, you can do solid wire or flux cord. Now, if you guys are unfamiliar, flux cord, it is what it says. The wire is cored with flux. So flux is this powdery mineral. Whenever you weld, this mineral like melts and evaporates and atomizes and turns into like a gaseous cloud around your weld pool to do the same thing as an inert shielding gas would do, which is fine and dandy, and this machine does it. It's capable of it. However, if you use regular old just solid steel wire like you would use for most like auto body applications, or let's say you're inside of a shop, you're not worried about wind or whatever. If you use regular solid steel wire, you have to use a shielding gas. And don't get me wrong, this machine is capable of using a shielding gas, but like I mentioned, the stuff that comes in the kit, you can't do everything. First of all, being hooking up a shielding gas. They give you a hose to hook up to the back of the machine and hook up to a tank and a regulator and all that crap, but there is no regulator. It doesn't come with a regulator to hook up to a tank. So if you choose to use this thing for solid steel MIG welding, you're going to need a regulator and a tank if you don't already have one. Well, obviously, you're not going to get a shielding gas tank if you buy a machine. That's on you to go to your welding supply place and get your own tank. But what I'm getting at is this thing doesn't come with a regulator. It's just a hose. So honestly, I feel like this is kind of like a tease. Like, hey, we know you can do it, but you're going to need to get your own regulator. So I feel like you could have thrown a regulator in the box, but I digress. Since we're talking about lack of stuff in the box, the TIG welding thing, the tungsten inert gas, that is a whole nother animal completely on its own. You know, for the dare I say novice or amateur, or doing stuff on the weekend or just dabbling in the welding stuff, stick welding and MIG welding is where you want to be. Don't get me wrong, it still takes skill. It still takes practice to know how to do this stuff, and this will get you through 95% of the things that you need to do. But TIG welding is a whole nother chapter. That's the new King James Bible. It is a totally different thing that you really need to devote yourself to learn how to do correctly. Now, this machine can do it, and from what I understand from my research, it can do it rather well. However, the TIG welding process takes a bunch of other stuff that isn't here. Like this whole MIG wire stinger gun setup thing, there's a whole nother one of these just for TIG welding. It has its own torch, it has its own lead, and believe it or not, TIG welding takes a shielding gas. TIG, tungsten inert gas. It takes a gas with a regulator. But traditionally, you would use a different style of regulator with TIG. So like MIG would use a regular, like turn the knob regulator, if you're familiar, out of picture, maybe, I don't know. And then TIG would use a regulator, which we refer to as a flow meter, like this one right here, where there's like actually like a vial and then a ball that goes up and down so you can monitor CFM and like actually how much flow is coming out of your gun. But either way, what I'm getting at is this thing does all this stuff, but it doesn't give you the capability right out of the box to do all of this stuff. So it's cool if you've done your research to get to this point and you're thinking this might be the ticket for you. But if you want to do everything that this thing can do, you can't do it all right out of the box. There is some ancillary stuff you're going to have to get. So I don't know. Now that I'm done rambling about that crap, let's actually go over this thing and see what it's all about. One more thing I forgot to mention. This thing is actually capable of using a spool gun for wire-fed aluminum welding also. Now, if you did do your homework and you're here because of that, you probably already knew that. But I genuinely forgot until I looked at it. But, if TIG welding is its own thing, spool gun welding is definitely its own thing. Now, it's awesome that this thing can do it, but just let you know, that's also another thing that this is capable of. So let's get all this crap out of the road here. We got some extra drive rollers and nozzle parts and stuff that we'll go over later. You getting seen that, ground clamp, yada, yada, yada. The machine.
The machine.
So you see here on the front, fancy full color backlit LCD display. We got some knobs and doodads that do different things that we'll go over here in a minute. And then we got the front of the machine where everything plugs into and all that crap. Now here on the right hand side, you can see these fancy little knobs. Whoop. Look at that. It's even lit. How do you like that? This is our wire feed well. Now, in case you guys genuinely are new to the field of welding and you haven't really dug into one of these things, this is a super standard setup for most MIG machines. I would say, let's 90 or so percent of the bigger machines. Some of the smaller ones have the spool laying horizontally on top of the machine, like somewhere up here. But almost all the ones you're going to run into have the spool vertically on the side going into the wire feed. So wire feed, I use that term. That is this guy right here. So if you'll remember, I talked about earlier a liner inside of the gun. This is what I'm talking about. It's this same stuff. This isn't actually the liner. This is just the in-feed into the feed rollers, but it's the same stuff. It's pretty much just a spring that allows the wire to go through it. Now, once we get into the drive roller itself, there are different parts to this thing. We have the drive roll that's actually connected to the motor that promotes the drive of the wire. And then on this side, we have what's called an idler. Then up here, we have a tension knob. You see here how there's different marks on it. That just kind of gives you a guide to let you know where you are in the tension of this thing and how much pressure you're putting down. So inside of here, there is a spring that determines the amount of clamping pressure between the idler and the drive roller. So depending upon where you put this thing is how much it squishes these rollers together, how much it clamps the wire, and how much force it uses to push it through the gun. Now to utilize this thing and get everything ready, you simply flick this down, this guy pops up. That frees your idler and your drive roller. Now on this particular one, the idler roller is just a smooth-faced ball bearing. That's fine and dandy. This thing does not need to get changed. But the drive roller down here, we can unscrew the cap here and change the drive roller from different gauges of wire, whether you're running 30, 35, 40, 45, whatever you're running. See these notches inside of here? They are specific or particular sizes for the particular wire that you're running. And in that kit that I just threw on the floor, there are different size drive rollers for different size wire. So you need to know which wire you're running and which appropriate drive roller to put in here. You put the wire through here, get everything threaded, close this guy down, flip that up, put a little bit of tension on there, feed your wire through. Well, back on the topic of stuff that's not in the box, there is no MIG wire or flux cord supplied in this kit. Now, I'm not saying that's not an expected thing. Like if you go off and buy like a Miller or an ESAB or a Lincoln or something, you're probably not going to get a spool of wire with it. But okay, so there's no wire. You need to supply your wire or your welding rods or your TIG rods or whatever you're doing with this thing. But it's just one more thing that you got to get to make this thing work. So if you're trying to like just get this thing because you need to do something like this Saturday and you just want to open the box and use it, just keep that in mind. There is going to be some ancillary stuff that you need to get to make this thing work. Now, when it comes to the functions on the front of this thing, I'll try to be as brief as possible because there is a lot going on here and it's going to be contingent on what you're trying to do. However, everything here is gone over in detail in the book. So if you want like more particular detail about what's going on here, be sure to refer to the user manual because this can be pretty cumbersome if you're new to this. So first things first, right here in the middle, in between the two displays here, you see it says 110 volts. This is where it displays what voltage you are plugged into. So like I talked about earlier, either 120 or 240, it will tell you here and display which one you're plugged into. Now, these two displays on top here displays your voltage and your amperage. Two very important things whenever it comes to welding. And I really like that this one displays both because most, dare I say, lower end machines only give you one or the other. You usually don't get both. I really do like that you have both because the more you get into welding, these numbers mean a lot. And when you really need to dial this thing in, you need to be able to see both. This one here that says mode, this is how you change this display, and you have to tell the machine which process you're doing. So right now we are on wire feed MIG. You hit the button and it will toggle through. So right now we're on stick welding or SMAW, and we go over to TIG welding. This is that wire feed aluminum like spool gun MIG that we don't have. And then we go back to MIG. So technically, there are 4 different processes that this thing can do. Now, this button here that looks like a drive roller, that pretty much is what it is. This screen in the middle, which displays the size wire that you are running. So right now, the lowest one is 023, and you can toggle through to 030, 035, and 040. So evidently, that is the capabilities of the wire in this machine. So over here, this SIN button, this toggles the amperage screen back and forth between an amperage display and IPM, or in layman's term, wire feed speed. So whenever you use this one and the amperage knob toggles whatever is in the amperage screen there, this slows down or speeds up the wire feed speed. I cannot stress how important this is. It is absolutely crucial. The 3 things that you need for MIG welding, the most important, well, I mean, other than gas, oh, yeah, excuse me, is the ability to view, change, and adjust voltage, amperage, and wire feed speed. And the ability that this guy lets us do that, that's huge. I cannot stress it enough. So this little screen here next to the wire size location here, this is what you kind of tell it like what you're trying to do. So like what material and or gases or whatever flux, what kind of shielding you're trying to use for that material. So this particular one, the very first one, we toggle down here with this button that looks like a cross section of a piece of steel. This one up here is for steel, regular carbon steel, and if you're running 100% CO2. The next one is if we're running carbon steel with a mixed gas, like 75-25 or whatever. So I guess this may have something to do with the internal regulator or how it flows gas or whatever. Just we need to make sure we have these settings set correctly to make sure we get the best output. Going on down the line here, we have flux. So this would mean that I'm using gasless or flux cord wire. So I'm not supplying gas through the machine. My weld is supplying its own shield. Next one down, CRNI. This is for stainless steel. So, I mean, you can MIG weld stainless if you have the appropriate wire, but most typically you would TIG weld stainless. So since we can't do that, doesn't much matter. And the last one here, this is for aluminum or magnesium. And finally, this button here in the middle that we haven't gone over, this changes your type of weld in this last little display right here. So there's a thing called 2T, 4T, and spot, which I mentioned that we're going to go back over to here. So right now we are on 2T, meaning every time you pull the trigger, something happens. So zap, let go, zap, let go, zap. Now, if we change this over to 4T, that means every time I pull the trigger, it stays on. So trigger pull, zzz, trigger pull again, it shuts off. That is handy for some lengthy different stuff, or like if you're welding like expanded metal or something where you don't want to keep on stopping and starting. This can be handy, but for the most of the time, you're going to be running 2T. Now, another little handy thing here. These little dots, this is for spot welding. There is a mode specifically for spot welding. So whenever you pull the trigger, you just get a little zzz, and you can actually set that up here. Whenever we hit this button, change it over to spot, you can change how long your spot weld is on for. I gotta tell you, man, this is freaking handy. I actually really do like that. That's a good add-on. And down here is where like everything connects and plugs in. So all the stuff that you saw earlier, this is where it actually connects. So this little dongle whip guy hanging out here on the front, this is what connects your spool, like all your MIG gun, everything. This is what connects it to the power of the machine. So whether you're running positive or negative, so you need to know whether you're running solid steel wire or flux cord. So flux cord, in case you don't know, it needs to be DC electrode negative. So you need to hook up your gun to negative, and then your ground would go to positive. If you're running steel wire, it's DC electrode positive, so it would be like traditional polarity, if you will. But all that stuff's in the book. It's in the quick setup guide here on the side. Just make sure you know what you're doing when you're doing it. And then up here is where our MIG gun attaches. There's threads on the OD that the MIG gun actually threads into. This is where the wire comes through, and then we have some wire leads, you know, for your trigger and everything, and the gas comes through here. But this is how all that disconnects, and it's nice that this has the ability to come apart to leave this machine a little more streamlined. Now, I suppose, let me throw this thing together right quick in, you know, I don't know, maybe like the MIG configuration. I'll just put stuff in the front of this thing so you can see what's up. We'll go ahead and hook this thing up in DC electrode negative because I don't have the ability to run gas through this thing right now unless I tear stuff apart and get parts. We're just going to assume this is going to be DC electrode negative for flux cord welding. So that means we're going to hook up our ground to the positive outlet on the front, and then we're going to hook up our little whip to the negative. Now that's done. Man, I'm falling apart already. Now we can hook up our MIG gun. This guy simply indexes. There's only one way this thing can go in here. We'll plug this in, tighten her up. And that's all she wrote. Now that we have this thing connected, assuming that you have wire put into this thing, whenever you hit the button, I don't know if you guys can hear that. Now, most machines, whenever you're feeding and this thing sees that there's no arc, it will like kick up into a high gear and allow this thing to feed a lot quicker. So if you hold the trigger for a while and it doesn't see an arc, it should go for a couple seconds slow and then kick up high speed. Let's see if it does it. Sure does. It maxes out at 394 for wire speed, so that thing's cooking pretty good. Well, I suppose at risk of boring you to death with just talking about this thing, let's put some stuff together and throw some sparks. So yeah, at very least, we're going to try stick welding and MIG welding with flux cord because that's what you have the ability to do right out of the box. So yeah, I'm going to have to get together some material and some wire and rods and stuff, and then I don't know, we'll reconvene and do some stuff. Alrighty guys, new day, new location. Let's get into this thing. Plan is we are going to run this thing in stick welding and flux cord MIG welding. You know, because I'm here and I have the ability to use the big 240 volt power, we're going to do that just to like see the capabilities of this thing. Now, don't forget, this thing is dual voltage, so you can use 120 or 240, but for the sake of this test and just seeing the capability of this thing, we're going to run 240. Because honestly, I'm just curious to see what this little buzz box can put out. So let me put some stuff together, get this thing all set up, and then we'll meet back here and throw some sparks. All right, so you guys are going to have to excuse me. I did a little bit of playing around so I could actually see this thing work before I show you an arc. So here we have the machine set up on 240 volts. We are running 030 flux cord wire, and I have some 1/2-inch steel plate set up in a fillet or a T configuration. Right now, I got the machine running at 20 volts, 345 inches per minute on the wire feed, and 156 amps. So this thing is set up for the whole no gas, you know, just running flux cord, just run it. So let's go ahead and do this fillet. You guys can see what's going on. Contact. Clean this up just a little bit, show you guys what's going on. Whew. You can tell I've been out of the game for a little while, but that's not bad. Now guys, like I mentioned, this is 030 flux cord wire. I started here, finished here, so you get that like end crater. But this thing's actually dialed in pretty decently. I mean, you could definitely go more for the thickness of this iron here, but you can tell here at the toes of the weld, there's no undercut. She laid down pretty good. And with flux cord, you're never gonna get as nice of a weld as you would with regular solid steel wire. But all in all, I am pretty happy with this thing. It lays down pretty good iron. Well, already, now that we've kind of proven that the flux cord, wire feed works, let's just go ahead and take this exact same tee, flip it, and then we'll go ahead and use stick welding for the other side. I know you probably would never do this, but for what we're doing here, we're just gonna do it. So let me set this thing up for stick real quick, and it's super easy, we've gone over it. And we're gonna flip this thing and go to it. Alrighty, now we got this thing all set up for stick welding. It's super easy. All we do is just change our leads here in the front, real easy like we went over. We are going to use 70/18 1/8 inch rod because this is the most generic, most common, what you're going to run around rod. So we're simply going to do the same fillet on the opposite side of this here iron and see how she turns out. I'm running at about 135 amps in case you're wondering. Contact. I'll tell you what, not great, but not bad either. We'll go ahead and ship that. Take a gander. That's not terrible. May have been a little hot, but it wasn't exactly as flowy as I would like either. It's one of those old-timey things like I was taught long ago. Like, if it sounds like bacon, you're doing a good weld. If it smells like bacon, you're on fire. But I don't know, I was kind of getting some pop in there. I don't know, maybe it's old rods or dirty material or who knows. But I mean, case in point, it welds. It does look decent. I'll show you. So you can see here, we started here, ended here because you drag with slag. At least that's the way that I was brought up learning anyway. And we got a little bit of undercut at the toes, and like I said, that might be just this thing running a little bit hot or a little spotty along the way. But all in all, this thing doesn't really look bad. I mean, and for the thickness of this material, that machine's pushing it. So I think we're doing pretty good with this. Now, I know there's a bunch of different stuff that this machine can do, but I know I've already kept you here for probably a minute longer than you wanted to be. So there's one last thing that I kind of like want to try because I don't have a machine that currently does it, and it's that spot welding thing. I'm kind of assuming that it's just gonna like pull the trigger, hold it on for X amount of time, shut it off, and kind of just do the thinking for you. But either way, I'm gonna set up a nice little lap joint, and I just wanna try it just because. So now I got the machine back set up for MIG and for spot welding specifically. And this thing is super easy to switch around. There really isn't much to it. A couple button pushes and a couple plugins in the front, that's it. So right now I have this thing set up to run a half of second spot weld, a stitch weld. So I haven't really played with the settings, so I don't know if this is gonna be great or not, but this isn't a review about how well I can weld. It's just if this thing does what it's supposed to do. So let's take a gander at this little lap joint I put together here and see how it works. Now, can you guys see that? I'm not stopping it. The machine is with a timer. I tell you what, this doesn't look great because it's flux cord, but I could see a real thing with this in solid wire. Well, fellas, all said and done here. I know we didn't go crazy with testing and do absolutely everything this can do, but like I mentioned earlier, there are caveats to everything. But all in all, what do I think? I think this thing is a screaming deal for what it is. If you're looking for a good multi-process, kind of do it all welder for your home, farm, shop, whatever you're doing, like small stuff on the weekends, like not opening your own business with this thing, but if you need to get stuff done and you need multiple ways to get that thing done, this ArcCaptain MIG200 just might be the ticket for you. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. I know it was a little long-winded, but there's a lot to welding if you're just getting into this. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this little review, and this thing can get you out of a bind that you're stuck in. So we will see you guys next time.